Добрый день.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear guests. We're beginning the panel session for the defense of the thesis by Ida Shik. The thesis is submitted in conformity with the requirements for the academic degree of the candidate of art history. The specialization is 170009, theory and history of art. The topic of the thesis is Surrealist photography of the 1920s and 1970s, the key concepts and problems. Under the order issued by St. Petersburg State University as of May 20, 2019, number 5313/1, the following content of our dissertation board is outlined. Valery Savchuk, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor of the Department of Culturology, Philosophy of Culture and Aesthetics of St. Petersburg State University. Boris Sokolov, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor of the Department of Culturology, Philosophy of Culture and Aesthetics of St. Petersburg State University. Lyudmila Limanskaya, the Doctor of Art, Russian State Humanitarian University. And remotely via Skype, we have Lev Manovich, PhD, the City University of New York, the United States of America. And under the order, I, Evgeny Makievsky, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor of the Department of Culturology, Philosophy of Culture and Aesthetics of St. Petersburg State University, have been appointed the chairperson of this dissertation board. First of all, I would like to note that under the federal laws of August 23, 1996, number 127, on science and state scientific and technical policy, St. Petersburg State University is entitled to confer academic degrees. The corresponding order was issued by the university September 1st, 2016, and the number is 6821/1 on the procedure of granting academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University. And the current session of the dissertation board is being held in accordance with this order, and according to the order, the session of the dissertation board is valid, providing 2/3 of the appointed board members are present. The total number should be not fewer than 4 people. Our dissertation board consists of 5 people. Everyone is with us today, including 1 member of the board via Skype. Therefore, we have a quorum, and therefore we can start our work. Our session should not last more than 2 hours, and the agenda is as follows. So once again, I would like to stress no more than 2 hours. If we'll have very fruitful and intensive work, anyway, I believe we'll manage to make a decision in 2 hours. So the first in our agenda is the chairman's presentation about the documents submitted by the candidate for the degree and their conformity with the requirements. Second, the candidate's presentation providing an overview and the findings of the research. And Ms. Shik has 15 minutes for that. Then it will be, the presentation will be followed by questions to the candidate regarding their presentation. No more than 2 minutes for each question. 4. Reports on the thesis by the board members. The board members will be taking the floor in turns by the orders of our names stated in the decree of St. Petersburg State University. So each of the board members would be given 10 minutes, and it would be great if you would stick to the time limit. 5th item of our agenda, the chairman's the candidates' comments about the reports, then open discussion. Everyone can ask a question, and Ms. Shik will provide an answer for them. But there's one point during the open discussion. We ask everyone who's going to ask a question to give your full name, the position, the place of work, and please fill in the registration form because this is necessary for our protocol. Next, the candidates' replies to the questions 5 minutes. Then the presentation of the candidate's thesis supervisor. Then a 5-minute discussion before the open balloting. The board has an opportunity to discuss the possible results, and we will ask the guests to leave for this period of time so that we would make the joint decision and stop the broadcast for this period of time. And after our discussion, I will invite everyone to the hall once again. After that, we are going to have an open balloting, a decision-making procedure, and finally we are going to listen to the candidate's closing speech. So that is our agenda for today. And before proceeding with the agenda, I would like to ask everyone who forgot to do that to switch off your mobile phones and other gadgets so that we won't hear any noise. And I would like to inform you that the panel session of the Dissertation Board is being recorded and broadcast on the website of St. Petersburg State University, and it is interpreted from Russian into English. So, let me start. And our first item is, and that's the chairman presentation on the documents submitted to the board. So the thesis of Ida Shik for the academic degree of the candidate of art history, specialization 170009, theory and history of art, titled Surrealist photography of the 1920s, 1970s, the key concepts and problems, was approved for the defense by the order of the academic secretary of St. Petersburg State University, issued April 26, 2019, number 4365/1. The Dissertation Board was appointed by the order of the academic secretary of May 20, 2019, number 5313/1, and I have already introduced the members. The candidate has submitted the following documents to the academic secretary. First, an application in the name of the rector, Professor Nikolai Kropachev, with a request to examine the thesis and accept it. For the defense, it was submitted September 6, 2019. Second, the report of the supervisor, Anatoly Rykov, Doctor of Philosophy, candidate of art history, professor of the Western European Art Department of St. Petersburg State University. Third, the list of 9 published works that describe the research findings and 4 academic papers have been published in peer-reviewed journals recommended by the Ministry of Education and Science. Fourth, letter of verification issued by St. Petersburg State University as of October the 4th, issued by St. Petersburg State University, certifying that Ms. Shik passed the candidacy exams under specialization 500601 art history, and the exams are as follows: history and science philosophy, English and theory and history of art, and she passed all the exams, getting A marks. Fifth document, the St. Petersburg State University postgraduate diploma AS number 00556, issued July 14, 2018 by St. Petersburg State University, certifying that July 2nd, 2018, Ms. Demetriou was awarded the qualification of clinical research and research instructor, mastering the academic training program in the history of art. Sixth, the thesis in Russian and English, a printed version with a manuscript copyright and a digital copy. The thesis format complies with the GOST standard, and it should be noted that all the above-mentioned documents comply with the item 12 of section 3 of the order on the procedure of granting academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University, Annex 1 to the order. So, if there are no questions for the content of the documents, then allow me to give the floor and pass to the next item, and to give the floor to Ms. Shik for her short report. Distinguished members of the Dissertation Board, distinguished guests, I would like to give you a report on my thesis, Surrealist Photography of the 1920s, 1970s, the key concepts and problems submitted for the degree of candidate of art history and studies. My supervisor is Mr. Rykov. The relevance of the study of surrealist photography of 1920s, 1970s is outlined by the fact that the ideas and visual vocabulary of surrealism are actively used by contemporary art, and the problems risen by this avant-garde movement still continues to agitate human beings, and the relevance is stipulated by the fact that photography was central in theoretical thought and creative practice of surrealism. In domestic historiography still, surrealist photography does not get a lot of attention, and the research of surrealist photography of the 2070s carried out in this dissertation will allow to partially fill in this gap and will promote the development of the theoretical framework for its further study. The chronological framework of research includes the periods from 1920s, 1970s that cover the creative life of the leading representatives of surrealist photography. And as for the territorial borders, here we have the countries where this development of surrealist photography was most fruitful: France, Belgium, Great Britain, the Czech Republic, the United States of America, and Mexico. The object of research includes the works of photographers that were close to historic surrealism or worked with the concepts, with this concept. And as for the subject, it includes the artistic and aesthetic variety, psychological and philosophical philosophy aspects, and social and political connotation of surrealist photography. And the main goal is to provide a comprehensive theoretical research of surrealist photography of this period and the relevant problems of social and philosophy discourse of the 20th century. And the research demonstrated that surrealism theoreticians appreciate photography greatly for the opportunity to present an object from different points of view. And for them, photography is the best means to disclose surrealism in the real, and the photographers view the photography as a means of creative self-expression and representation of their aesthetic ideas. And their work demonstrated that surrealist photography represents an international phenomenon which, considering the formal and stylistic variety, has still a conceptual specificity, a unified one. And the notion of stylistical surrealist photography may include the work of photographers that were close to surrealism and the works of photographers that continuously worked with its aesthetic and philosophy ideas. And the research demonstrated that documentaries, stage and manipulation photos can be successfully used for the representation of surrealist ideas. And the key concepts are the concepts of autonomous double image, paradoxal juxtapositions, convulsive beauty, the formless, found object, and surreality. And special role is given given to irony and the black humor. And within the framework of philosophy discourse of the 20th century, the surrealist photographers are concentrated on the need to provoke a comprehensive and intellectual moral crisis, using the problems of decentralization of subject and subversive sexuality and variability of gender identity. And interacting with social discourse of the 20th century, surrealist photography concentrates on the need to create an ethnography of most developed societies and research the unconscious of a contemporary city. Photography represents surrealist nonconformity, concentrating on anti-bourgeoisie, anti-colonial, anti-fascist, and anti-war problems. During the research of social political problems, the photographers work on using the principle of the return of the repressed, disclosing the inner part of social reality, and the events of the Second World War are reflected in the topics of death and destruction, and the interpretation is becoming very straightforward. And the art of post and post-postmodernism works with such concepts as convulsive beauty, formless, black humor, surreality, paradoxical juxtapositions, and philosophy problems actualized by surrealist photography will also be interpreted in contemporary art. Contemporary photographers demonstrate interest in the problems of establishment of the self and the transformation of personality into a set of masks and transgressive sexuality. And summarizing, it should be noted that the scientific novelty is stipulated by the fact that this dissertation is the first in domestic work in domestic historiography that provides for a comprehensive theoretical research of surrealist photo of the above-mentioned period. And the peculiarity of this dissertation is that surrealist photography is considered as an international phenomenon that has a unified conceptual specificity. And this dissertation has researched the problem of interpreting photography in surrealism and this topic was not given a lot of attention previously. The work has carried out gives you a detailed analysis of the representation of the surrealism concept in the photo art of the above-mentioned period, and I've studied the key approaches to the interpretation of the motive of ancient paranoid wall and the concept of the found object. And also the author provides a notion of anti-aesthetic still life, and the dissertation considers the structure of images of surrealist photographers created by the principle of paradoxical juxtapositions. And also there are key strategies with the concept of surreality provided by surrealist photography, and there is a link established with it between it and the photography medium. And also I've researched the interconnection between the creative strategies of photographers with philosophy and social discourse, and special attention is given to the works created during the war period, and the work outlines those concepts of surrealist photography that will be in demand by photo art of post and post-postmodernism. Theoretical and practical value of the research is outlined by the fact that the dissertation developed a concept base for the analysis of surrealism art that can be applied both in the studies of surrealist pictorial art and graphics, but also when we use the materials on creative practice of post and post-postmodernism. This material can be used to create lecture courses or books on the history of art of this period of time, and the materials were presented at scientific conferences in St. Petersburg and in Moscow in 2014, 2017. And the key results are reflected in 9 publications. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Ida. And the guests and members of the board can ask questions to Ida on the essence of her presentation. We'll have time for a large-scale discussion, but still, now we can discuss the provisions that she outlined. So please, Valerie, have the floor. Ms. Shik, in your work, you've described and you were based upon the 383 photographies that were presented, and that's what's interesting to me. How well do you know them in paper, not in the digital version? Which of them did you manage to see in a published way? Well, you see, unfortunately, I didn't have an opportunity to work with these paper sources in the storages of foreign museums yet. I've seen number of works, for example, at the exhibition of Monterey, at the Pushkin Research University. I've seen part of that, and there was an exhibition of the Paris School. There, I've managed to see some of his works as well. No, not Monterey, but Brosai works, and also several times I visited the Czech Republic and saw the exhibition of the Czech Museum and had a chance to see a range of works there. And also I went to an exhibition of Miroslav Gag 2 years ago, and I also had a chance to see these works. But overall, I would like to say that these photos are quite widespread spread, and I believe we can use all digital sources to study them. And many works are given as photo books, for example, The Night Paris of Brossai, because I have a, well, late publication of the book, but still. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, no questions then. Thank you very much, Ms. Shik. I believe there are no questions on the presentation. Therefore, let's shift to the reports by the members of the board. And as our names are given in the order, I would like to follow this order. Therefore, I would like to give the floor to Valery Savchuk, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor of the Department of Culturology, Philosophy of Culture and Aesthetics of St. Petersburg State University. So please, you have the floor. Maybe you can sit. Well, that changes a lot. Distinguished colleagues, distinguished members of the Dissertation Board, and the guests. We're now present on the defense of the very interesting thesis which is wonderful from all points of view. So let's go step by step. What was done? If we get distracted from the details, overall, a very good and serious study was performed, taking into account the fact that in this segment of Surrealist research, the work of Ms. Shik outlines and emphasizes photography. In her report, she outlined that photography was most interesting and significant for Surrealist movement. Basically, that may be true, yet as for the general impression, they're mostly connected with manifestos, art, drawings, and photography is not does not rank first here, and this may arise certain interest, this concentration of photos. Moreover, due to the fact that such an approach to this subject, especially in our domestic research, is rather rare, considering such an overview, because our domestic literature actually lacks it. Yet another point about what was done by Ms. Shik. All these principles of Surrealism that were tested in different genres, including the term of low materialism, that really interested me. They were introduced to the sphere of photography, and substantiation was found for these initial positions and principles. And I would like to repeat that once again. It was done really well and really seriously. Once again, not to forget that, later on I would like to mention the style and the clarity of thought, because basically we pay attention on these issues when there is nothing to be told about the benefits of the dissertation, but I have a lot to say about the benefits of the dissertation. But above all, I would like to mention that the clarity of thought, the dissertation is easy to understand and it's quite logical. So I won't take too much time, your time and my time, by describing the dissertation and its key provisions. And I just want to think together with the author rather than give some criticisms, because I presume that some of my thoughts are caused not by the quality of work, but rather by the difference in discourse, art history and philosophy ones. So, considering the high level of work, it is still it has still some drawbacks. It usually happens like that, because if it's perfect, it means that we can think that something may be wrong with it. It's not live. And what can I comment upon, considering the promising fields for the development of these plots and topics that were risen by the author? First, and I graduated from the logics department when I was a student, and as for the title, it's called Surrealist Photography of 1920-1970s. It's restricted by the temporary frame, and the dissertation gives us an explanation why the author chose 1970. This was the end of life of the leading authors and photographers who worked in Surrealist photography. Yet, there is such an umbrella term, Surrealist photography, and it cannot be restricted in space, even if it can be restricted in time. Maybe there could be a subheading here outlining these countries: France, Czech Republic, the United States, and others. Well, it's easily understood intuitively, and the hierarchy can be understood intuitively, because we all know that when there's a violation of the alphabetic principle, it means that there are certain criteria introduced. For example, historical development according to historical state, and if we're talking about a single point of time, then we are talking about some kind of hierarchy. And it seems that it would be clear here, considering French surrealism that outlined the spheres of development, the canons, the benchmarks for the Surrealist movement, and accordingly Belgium, Great Britain, and the list ends with Mexico. Well, as far as I see it, it is easy to explain, though I didn't see any criteria here. And here I have a comment, a remark. Because here we lack domestic Surrealist photography, because not in the title of work, neither in the title of work, nor in the text of work, can we find the study of domestic works. And here I believe it would be expedient to place Russia after Mexico, which is quite a respected country in the history of art. And this, I believe, would be a really good and creative search. Yes, at first sight, it seems that we don't see enough of the countries represented, though the reasons are clear for us, because Russia didn't have a lot of such objects, but still the communications, the contacts, and even avant-garde movements, our people still knew these works. They reacted on them somehow, and someone tried to introduce certain elements, and even there was a dialogue, for example, in the argument with the mirror work. And I believe that Ms. Shik, knowing the subject so well, maybe in future she would write, maybe not a book, but an article on surrealist photography in Soviet Russia. I believe that would really be a kind of innovation and a new word in the research of surrealist photography or photography overall. And here I have a range of authors like Fomenko, Poetics of Soviet Avant-Garde, the doctor's dissertation, a quite recent one, and he also had an honor, and I also had an honor because this was a great work. I had an honor to work with this thesis as well, and he finds some analogies in the marginal range of Soviet avant-garde. For example, something irrational, something dark, ctonic origin, subordinate to rational settings. So I won't draw any analogies here, but still these items are reflected in Soviet photography, and I believe that is once again supports my idea. Unfortunately, neither Fomenko nor Irina Shmirova in her works on Russian photography, that is, by the way, the candidate of art, and I also used to work with her thesis as well. I was an opponent, and she says that by 1970s the first surrealist plots of Boris Savelyev, Sergei Chilikov, Mr. Likhachevsky arise, and Vadim Gushin followed them. And I believe that I would stop by this remark. And I also have some comments to add, not reproaches. This comment is about something quite obvious to the expert. That's the mixture of methodological and subject level. And at that we should understand, and we should note that that doesn't mean that they can't be used together, both of them, but we should strictly demonstrate the reader, and we should understand ourselves that now we're talking about historiography, about methodology of research, or we are talking about photography in essence, because the author said that the object of research includes the works of photographers, so the work with material, and as for reflection, that's a different level, and they provide one another, but we still should not mix them. And I've already mentioned that the low materialism term, I was really surprised by this term. Maybe that's just not a correct interpretation, but maybe this term should be adequately introduced, because it's really embarrassing for the reader. Yet, I won't dwell upon methodological problems, because that's not just a problem of this dissertation, because I'm a member of many expert boards, and methodology, strangely enough, proves to be a serious hindrance in obtaining grants, for example. And here the author is abstractly using philosophy approaches, cultural approaches, without being specific with them, and I believe that can't be tolerable. Though this interpretation reduces the overall assessment, but still it does not influence the general positive assessment of the dissertation, a promising research in art studies. It is really valuable for the whole range of philosophy, sociocultural, and first and foremost art history disciplines. And the results that were received by the author can be used in the analysis of contemporary situation. And as for the problems and the interaction of philosophy and pictorial art, so all these fields can be taken into account. The publications correspond to the content of the dissertation, and this dissertation of Ms. Shik, Surrealist photography of 1920s, 1970s, key concepts and problems, is an independent scientific research that has relevance and novelty in resolving the set goals, and it corresponds with major requirements outlined by the order. I won't give you the number, but the order on conferring academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University. Thank you very much. Thank you, Valerie. Ms. Shik, are you going to answer after all the board members spoke out? Yes, let's answer after everyone spoke out. So, Valerie, you support conferring the degree? Yes. Yes. Fully support that. Now, Mr. Sokolov, the Doctor of Philosophy, the Professor of St. Petersburg State University. Distinguished colleagues, well, I'll be very short, because what I've written is something that you can all see on the website, and therefore I just don't want to read my words. The work written by Ms. Shik, I liked it a lot. Certainly there are difficulties in a situation when the person wants to work at the intersection of not just art studies, but also try to interpret it from the point of view of some philosophy summarization. Therefore, as for the reproaches that were voiced about methodology, well, as for methodology, what methodology can be applied here? You see, when the person wants to get to the philosophy level, sure enough, this person will use two methodologies: art study and those humanistic procedures that are quite powerfully used. Certainly they are different, once again. A creative work is really valuable by the fact that it's open the horizon of to the horizon of all possible interpretations, and they are really indefinite. And as for unified methodology, you know, it's just the level of the 19th century here. Therefore, sometimes it's just funny to hear that methodology is irrelevant, because the 19th century is the plurality of methodology and truth, if we can talk about methodology at all. And here we have a very interesting text. The only thing is, well, I'll be based on my report. If there were any questions about whether photography was an art, but after reading this work, there are no questions like that left. And in this regard, what Ms. Shik undertakes using the example of surrealist photography is something particularly important, because first of all we see the genesis, and there was not a single integral work, comprehensive work that considers the entire time period, because everything that's dealing with the 70s, well, I believe we can't call it surrealist because the trends changed. Yet these are the questions for discussion, and demonstrating genesis of the origin of the unity of the language, the surrealist language, everything of that is reflected, as well as the huge material that was analyzed. And I would like to see this work result not just in a dissertation, not just result in some articles that are quite adequate and correspond, but also correspond to the essence of the thesis, but also into a monography. Because when I read this work, that's not a reproach, that's just an idea. I would like to see it in integrity, in a larger integrity, because I understand that dissertation requires certain limitations. From my point of view, I won't give you some reproaches because I've outlined them, but these are not reproaches but some formalities because the person wants to comment on some drawbacks and give some advice. Well, anyway, I liked the work a lot. I believe it's really relevant, that it really fills a lot of gaps that exist in the research of surrealism as a movement and surrealist photography overall, and it really expands the horizons of photography opportunities. Therefore, the text is adequate, it's written quite in a logical manner, it proves all the provisions, and my overall conclusion is that the dissertation of Ms. Shik, Surrealist Photography of 1920s, 1970s, Key Concepts and Problems on the Theory of Arts, is, from my point of view, is a decent dissertation. And what are these words? These routine words. Yes, I fully support conferring the academic degree. I really support the author, and I believe as for other positions about correspondence, well, really this work fully corresponds. That's an independent, creative, in-depth study. And as for philosophy, well, it's not that easy for a person to understand. And I, as a philosopher, believe that she understood all the philosophical aspects quite successfully. Thank you very much. Yes, and I would prefer to have an answer later on after everyone. Okay, thank you very much. Elena Limanskaya, Doctor of Art, Russian State Humanitarian University. I would like to support my colleagues in the assessment of this work. It is really fascinating to read it, and indeed I would like to see it as a monography, because the research is not only original from the point of view of considered problems, but also it is quite practical from the point of view of this fact that surrealist photography is not studied well and is not reflected in our literature. I have philosophy and art education, and for me this intersection of philosophy, sociology, psychology, politics, that is a topic quite interesting for me, and that's quite a serious problem of the material, and I was really glad that the author managed to cope with such fundamental work. She chose the material, elaborated on it, and from the point of view of art study, there are interesting decisions made as for periods, the assessment of these periods, outlining the regional specificity that was characteristic for photography, France, Belgium, the Czech Republic, the United States, Mexico. I believe that it's really fascinating to see the analysis of psychological aspects, there's socio-psychological aspects that really specify surrealist photography as a certain politically active type of art that is trying to influence certain political processes in a, so to say, revolutionary aspect. And as for remarks, well, I won't stand out of my from my colleagues. From my point of view, methodology and methods of research, they are not strictly outlined and described, and as far as I see it from this point of view, the author could have described it better, because that's required to describe methodology, methods for any dissertation. Therefore, this point is not that obvious in the work. But as for the overall volume of the research problems and the novelty of this material, the points of view that the author used, they are so interesting and original that the work, as far as I see it, is productive indeed. Therefore, I support the conferring of the academic degree to the author. Thank you very much, Ludmila. Then Dr. Manovich, the City University of New York. Mr. Manovich, do you hear us? Yes, sure enough. Thank you. Dear colleagues, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to take part in the session, in this process. Though I frequently visit Russia, and for the recent 4 years I've visited different universities, but still it's the first time that I take part in the discussions of the dissertation board. Therefore, if I say something wrong, please, I beg your pardon me. But still, I decided to participate because it was very interesting for me to learn how it happens. That's a very interesting and pleasant process. First of all, I submitted my written report, and I agree with my colleagues. I believe that the work is really a good one. And as for the size, as for the coverage, and as for the number of works, I just don't know such works in the Russian language, and maybe not only in the Russian language. Therefore, I believe that everything that should have been done was done for the academic degree. Therefore, I support the conferring of academic degree. Though I have certain comments, they may look critical, but they are not critical because I want to criticize. But as for my experience of taking part at such sessions in the United States, quite frequently we consider that an opportunity to give certain comments to the candidate for the future. That's not to the dissertation, that's not a criticism, but there are certain issues that I thought about, and maybe the candidate would be interested in that as well, and maybe she will take that into account in her future work. As I've already mentioned, maybe the point that seemed most interesting and important for me is this encyclopedia-like analysis, and the fact that she included these names and works and the descriptions of works. And there are dozens or even hundreds of photographers from all over the world. The geographical coverage is very important for me because I always see in traditional art history that started to develop in the 20th century, they mostly choose some narrow canon and some more important photographers are left behind. But still, I have several questions. First, in her dissertation, the author writes that that is the first most comprehensive work on surrealist photography in Russia, and that's great. Yet, I don't know the criteria about the Russian criteria, but as we live in the 21st century and we are a part of some global historic discourse, for me that's the question of creating something original in the context of Russian art history and global art history, because overall what I'm accustomed for as for the thesis defenses, the author always demonstrates that his or her work makes some kind of original contribution, adds up something to the sphere as it is, to physics, to mathematics, IT, art, whatever. Therefore, I had a question, why are we restricted by the national borders? And from this point of view, I have the second question. Once again, it may be connected with the fact that there's a different discourse in Russia and some different rules how to describe your study, but maybe the candidate will be interested that, you know, I'm accustomed to see that the author tries to assure that his or her work adds up something original to the niche. And if we will compare the situation with different countries, I believe I don't see the description of original contributions of this work to the history and social culture sphere, for example, and to other spheres. Second point that I've mentioned, there are a lot of quotations and original sources and quotations from photographers, works, the data from the 20s, 30s and contemporary art study authors, the ones that I knew, but what lacks here is this detailed analysis and description of certain images and photos. Yet we can say that we can't deal without it. Yet, you know, as for the photography of the 50s, there was a trend in the history of art to, you know, we can describe certain trends, certain photographers, for example, Baroque style and so on, but maybe we'll find some contradictions here, some intersections or something like that. And I comment on that because I got a PhD in visual culture and I was the first to get such a degree, and this was this concept of close reading that we started using, and when we lack it, I usually see that. And just a couple of other things. What I would like to see, a more critical attitude to the historic works of certain Western art history experts that the author takes into account, not just quotations and using them as a kind of basis, but having a more critical view. We can compare them, we can juxtapose them, we can consider the differences, we can consider drawbacks and advantages of the theories, because that's a kind of, overwhelming support to the Western views, what we want to avoid, because, as my colleague said, that's great, but where can we find Russian photography and Russian avant-garde art of the 70s, of the 50s? Certainly we would like to see more Russian photography. Certainly we grew in an epoch when we understood that we are living in a kind of Soviet and post-Soviet surrealism. And this was the key characteristic of Soviet and even post-Soviet reality. Because I wanted to mention that this Russian context is something that we don't see in the work. And yet another question, and I'll finish with it. Through my entire life, I considered surrealist photography texts and movement I believe I was a bit skeptic, and I believe that's quite a widespread view, because when we consider that there is this movement in modernism that describes the person and tries to describe the contemporary epoch, the poetics, the art, the visual and spatial language that suits reality, real efficiency, and something that we have right now. And as for surrealism, that's a kind of position, something revolutionary, something negative, possibly, because they're using some canons, physicality, and the elements like that. That's true, but as we are talking about an in-depth study, it would be interesting to see. Well, once again, I understand that the author can't do everything, but it would be interesting for me to see these ideas, well, questioned, because always surrealism has always been contradicting traditions, machines, construction of the establishment of capitalist society. Or maybe we can find something new here, and here I start thinking about some grotesque forms of other authors. For example, this Chaplin film, that's a kind of satire to a mechanization process. Therefore, I believe we can find certain points that are describing surrealism, but at the same time they're critical and describe this world in a different manner. Maybe we can, well, just to sum up, I beg your pardon for not speaking Russian quite well. Well, it will be interesting to find some discourses and images in surrealism, maybe some statements that would stand for modernity rather than for what's fading away. And yet another last point. As the dissertation pays a lot of attention to surrealism, to surrealist photography, to aesthetic photography, once again everything was great in the dissertation, but that's the question that I had. It's always interesting to think about surrealist photography as something holistic, and maybe this would be interesting to have a kind of hypothesis that that's a set of elements, some cognitive elements that we can find everywhere, maybe some abstracts in pop art and in other fields. So what is that surrealist photography? And certainly these questions are beyond the borders of the study, but as it's an in-depth study still, I would like to ask what subject is. Does it exist, or was it created by an author? What surrealist photography is? And so these are these remarks and notes that I had, and I would like to finish with the following words. Everything is great and wonderful, but for me, the main thing I didn't find here is a more specific indication on what's original in this dissertation from the point of view of contemporary global art history and visual culture history. And it's really easy to confer a degree because the author did something that was never done in Russia before, but I would like to see a bit more. But within the framework of this work, I liked everything, and I really support conferring the academic degree to the author. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. So the last report. I'm really pleased to join my colleagues, my more advanced colleagues, And I really had a wonderful impression after reading the thesis. Therefore, I won't list all its benefits, but I want to concentrate on some drawbacks that the work has. First thing, the work repeats the thought of Hall Foster. Surrealists are eager to frustrate capitalist society by the fact that they have that it has history, and this thought illustrates different ideas 4 times, but this thought is not philosophically explicit in the dissertation, and maybe if it would be done correctly, I as a reader would get more familiar with these changes in the history of photography. Well, sometimes past may be frustrating, sometimes not. Therefore, it would be interesting to learn who is the donor of surrealist photography in this regard. But that's just a critical remark. Second, in the introduction and in the conclusion of the dissertation on 3 pages, we see the description of the general history of surrealist photography. It is described in details in the conclusion paragraph of the 3rd chapter. And as for the general history, how concepts replaced each other, how, for example, the concept of erotism or the problem of erotism in surrealist photography was replaced by the physicality problem, and this it in turn would give way to gender ideas or to any other problems that are described by Ms. Shik, because, you know, I didn't see this historicity in your narration. For example, this period is characterized by that and that, or maybe everything could be present in any surrealist photography together, and there is no historism. So this would be easier to see this event from such a point of view, from such a dynamics. And third, the consideration of interaction between surrealism and the discourse of the 20th century is restricted by the interaction with psychoanalysis. For example, maybe there was a connection with Marxism or existentialism, and in this case, how? And only if it had a connection with psychoanalysis, then why? Therefore, I would be glad to see a comment on that. But overall, all of that could be considered as some small remarks, and the dissertation of Ms. Shik on the topic of surrealist photography of 2070s, key concepts and problems, correspond to the key requirements outlined by the order on the conferring of academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University. And the candidate, Ms. Shik, deserves being conferred the academic title of the candidate of art studies in specialization 170009, theory and history of art, and article 11 of the order is not infringed. So, Ms. Shik, now when all the reports were voiced, could you please comment on them? Dear members of the dissertation board, first of all, I would like to thank you for the constructive criticism and remarks, for the proposals that you've made, because they will help me in my future work. And I will start to answer to Valery Vladimirovich. In my dissertation, I concentrated attention on the development of surrealist photography in those countries that had the groups of surrealists and photographers, and the study of parallels between surrealism and Russian photography, and domestic art. That's a topic of a serious and in-depth research that I plan to proceed to in the future. And as for the works of domestic authors, for example, of Mr. Fomenko, Mr. Mariova, the work of Mr. Fomenko, well, I just finished reading it, and I'm really sorry I haven't read it before. And as for the work of Irina Shmirova, I will read it sure enough and draw some conclusions, and I hope that I'll manage to use this knowledge in my future work. As for methodological comments, I just want to thank Valery Vladimirovich for them, and I hope that in the future I will more strictly describe the object, the methodology and methods of my research. Because for me it's just an idea for my future work. As for low materialism, that's not the only option of how to translate it. It can be used as basic materialism as well, and really Valery Vladimirovich noted that this term is not very well, and it can't be very well understood. Maybe it could be used as basic materialism, because otherwise instead of base we get low materialism, and in this case maybe that's not that won't be clear for a foreign reader in this case. As for Mr. Sokolov, I just want to thank him because I didn't hear any critical remarks. I just thank you for the comments. And as for Mr. Manovich, the main comment, as far as I understood, is that I did not sufficiently demonstrate in my work. I didn't demonstrate the contribution of my work to the world art studies. Why I wrote this work? After reading a lot of books on surrealist photography, at some point I wanted to have one book on the topic that would include everything. That the person opens a book on surrealist photography and he or she learns about the development of surrealist photography in 20s and 30s in France, for example, but also he sees a broader range of works of photographers from all over the world. Therefore, I wanted to combine everything together, and in the world art studies, an example of such work is an example of, for example, the work of Mr. Jaguet, Edouard Jaguet. And Edouard Jaguet is a representative of late surrealism. And this can be called a monography. That's an album with an introductory article with photos and comments. So there was not some holistic view. There was no holistic view, and that's an outdated work, and new theoretical methodological approaches now emerged. Therefore, I wanted to create such a word to add it to domestic and to global art historiography. As for the comments, for example, on the need to analyze the interaction between surrealism and domestic cultural discourse, on the need to have a critical view on the works that I'm referring to, well, I believe that in my future work I will pay more attention to that. And as for the comment of Mr. Makovetsky, as for the fact that I didn't pay a lot of attention to the history of surrealist photography, why did it happen? Because in my work I wanted to demonstrate that surrealist photography is an international phenomenon with a unified specificity, and a detailed consideration of the history would make the dissertation more interesting for the reader, but still it was not among my priority goals. The outlined concepts and problems were relevant for surrealist photography during the entire period of its development, and that's what I wanted to demonstrate, considering the photo shots of different authors. The level of interest and the strategies of interpretation, they may be different depending on the individual preferences of photographers and the context in which they worked. And if I'll manage to turn my dissertation into a monography, I will have a certain paragraph on the history of surrealist photography so that the readers would understand the progress and development. As for psychoanalysis, considering the interaction of photography with French discourse, I prefer to use psychoanalysis because it was closer to surrealists themselves, and Western art historiography considers surrealism through the prism of psychoanalysis. And as for such discourse as Marxism and existentialism, the analysis of the interaction, I believe it's a relevant and promising topic for my future work. And last thing, as for Hal Foster, analyzing the interaction of photography with social discourse of the 20th century and referring to Mr. Foster, I was writing the following thing. Surrealists actively use the images of outdated or destroyed in order to frustrate capitalist society by the fact that it has a past and to criticize its ideals. I don't give a direct quotation from Compulsive Beauty, but I just interpret his idea, and maybe it's incorrect to use this word, frustrate, as regards to the past and to history. So here is the detailed quotation. The capitalist outdated relativizes bourgeoisie culture and refutes claims for being natural and eternal, and opens up its own history and historicity. And in my dissertation, I directly quote Foster saying that surrealism represents capitalist dynamics of innovation as the process of collapse, and at the same time historicity of bourgeoisie regime is depicted via deliberate archaism of its form, and its transcendental ambitions are refuted through representation of its symbols as ruins. And surrealists are striving to emphasize that everything that was created by capitalist society gets outdated, as well as capitalism will become. And we're talking not about philosophical interpretation of the history, the past and value, but rather about the eagerness of surrealists to emphasize the vulnerability of capitalist society and its system of ideals. That's it. Thank you very much, Ms. Shik. If there are no questions from the members of the board, and if you're satisfied with the answers, then we are shifting to an open discussion. And I would like to remind dear guests that everyone can voice some comments on the work of Ms. Shik, but before taking the floor, please introduce yourself and you can comment on the work. So please, we have time for open discussion. Okay. As far as I believe, this report was so comprehensive and it really characterizes the talent of our author. And indeed, I believe that now we can shift to the next item in our agenda, and I would like to give the floor to the scientific supervisor, Doctor of Philosophy, candidate of Art Studies, Anatoly Rykov. Allow me to give my report. The dissertation of Ms. Shik is a result of many years of research in this field, and as it was mentioned, the dissertation has an extensive coverage of actual material, and it allows to create an holistic understanding of the development of surrealist photography of 20s, 70s, and besides the analysis of the most prominent authors, the author pays attention to the works of those masters whose creative life is studied less in foreign science, and this field is not familiar to our domestic experts. And Art study analysis is combined with a comprehensive theoretical interpretation of this surrealism photography phenomenon, and the dissertation provides a detailed analysis of representation of theoretical concepts of surrealism and also analyzes the interaction of creative strategies and artistic strategies with philosophy and social discourse of the 20th century. The author of the dissertation concludes on the specificity of surrealist photography, and from this point of view, the research and its key provisions of particular interest for us to understand this phenomenon and to interpret the reception of key concepts of surrealism photography. And it was already mentioned, that is the first research in domestic science of this type that provides where the conclusions are made from the point of view of state-of-the-art culturography literature, and the author demonstrates certain unity of methodological style, of methodology throughout the entire text of work that has demonstrated all the characteristics of a unified work. And as for the relevance, I believe it can't be questioned because it has demonstrated the most authentic character of surrealism art, and this art is systematized from different points of view: cultural, historic, psychological, philosophical, and social political one. Therefore, this dissertation corresponds with the passport of this specialization, and it can be submitted for the defense. The comprehensive approach that this dissertation has deserves putting it for the judgment of scientific community. Thank you very much, Anatoly. Next item of our busy schedule is the discussion by the members of the dissertation board, the discussion of the results. And for this period of time, I kindly ask you to leave the hall, dear guests. Yes, please. And Ms. Shik, you too. Yes, and please turn off the broadcast. finished the discussion of the dissertation, and we're shifting to the next item, the open balloting. So please turn on the broadcasting, make sure it works. And now let us have the open balloting. And I would like to remind you that the decision of the Dissertation Board on conferring the academic degree is positive, provided more than 50% of the board members, but not fewer than 3 people voted in favor. That's in conformity with Section 23 of the Order on the Procedure of Granting Academic Degrees of St. Petersburg State University. And in our case, no less than 3 members of the board should vote in favor. So let's go by the order of the decree. So I'll call the members of the board, and you should give us your opinion. So Valery Vladimirovich Savchuk, your opinion? I support granting the academic degree. Yes, I support granting the academic degree. Thank you. Then Mr. Sokolov, I support. Mrs. Limanskaya, I support. Mr. Manovich, your opinion? I support. Thank you very much, Mr. Manovich. In my opinion, Evgeny Makovetsky, I also support granting the academic degree. Thus, out of 5 present members of the board, and there are 5 of us in the order, all the 5 members of the board voted for granting the academic degree to Ms. Shik. No one voted against, and no one abstained from the vote. Therefore, the decision on conferring the academic degree of the candidate of arts study in specialization 170009, Theory and History of Art, to Ms. Shik is made. We congratulate you, Ms. Shik. So, just your final remarks. Please, you have the floor. Dear members of the Dissertation Board, I would like to thank you for your high appraisal of my dissertation, for the fact that you agreed to participate, and I would like to extend my gratitude to Mr. Manovich, who, being a very well-known researcher, still managed to find time and read my dissertation and come to our dissertation defense board. And I would like to thank Mr. Makovetsky for the fact that he was a chairperson and he moderated the session greatly. Thank you very much for that. And I would like to thank my scientific supervisor, Mr. Rykov, for helping me in my work on the thesis, for helping me to come to an end with my scientific work. And I would like to thank Roman Sokolov for doing a lot for this defense to happen. And I would like to thank the instructors of the Department of Russian Art and Western Art for instructing me for many years, and thanks to the education they gave me, I wrote this thesis and received this degree of the candidate. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Ms. Shik. Thank you very much to all the members of the Dissertation Board, to all the participants of our discussion. And I declare it closed, so please turn off the broadcast.